Here are 10 stories about the strange deaths of former presidents. 10. George Washington. When George Washington died in 1799, his will stated unequivocally that he wanted to be buried near his Virginia home. However, the mausoleum at his plantation, Mount Vernon, required extensive renovation to house the first president's remains. Prior to his death, Washington addressed the issue. He wrote about the vault repairs. "I desire that a new tomb of brick, and on a larger scale, may be built at the foot of what is commonly known as the vineyard enclosure, in which my ashes, along with those of my deceased relatives, may be interred." Unfortunately, that did not occur. Congress ignored his request and conspired to build a crypt in the United States Capitol. That memorial, however, had not been built by 1830, 3 decades after Washington's death. Washington's remains remained at Mount Vernon, but the vault there had not been renovated. Then strange things began to happen. In that year, John Augustine Washington II, the sole surviving heir and nephew of George Washington, sacked a gardener who had worked at Mount Vernon. The landscaper was furious over being fired and set out to exact revenge. In order to steal the late president's skull, he slipped inside the crypt. Thankfully, to prevent tampering after death, Washington's remains had been enclosed in the lead. However, due to the crypt's poor condition, dozens of people's bones were dispersed around it. The gardener stole the skull of a distant relative rather than a piece of Washington. The last Washington heir built a new tomb for the president a year later, and the rest, excuse the pun, is history. 9. James Cade Polk. In 1849, James Cade Polk passed away not long after his term came to an end. Cholera caused the death of the country's 11th president, who was promptly interred in a mass grave to halt the disease's rapid spread at the time. But that funeral was unworthy of a former president. Legislators in Tennessee ordered the remains moved after a year to a common grave in a Nashville city cemetery. Polk Place, where the president passed away, was supposed to be his final resting place. That was all there was for a while. However, the Polk family sold the large property in 1893. Once again, for a while, that was it. When that occurred, Tennessee officials moved Polk's remains to the state capitol in Nashville. Polk's final resting place was once again a subject of debate in 2017. The late president's last will and testament was in question this time. He asked to be interred at Polk Place in the paperwork. But shortly after his family sold it in 1893, that house was destroyed. In order to relocate the remains to a location in Columbia, which is an hour outside of Nashville, state legislators started the process. Politicians reasoned that the relocation would essentially fulfill Polk's request in his will because he had previously owned that residence. A resolution to relocate Polk once more was approved by the Tennessee legislature in 2018. The Tennessee Historical Commission, however, refused to grant permission to disturb the site, so it was put on hold 6 months later. 8. Zachary Tailor. Polk's successor passed away not long after Polk did. When Zachary Tailor passed away in 1850, a year into his term, he had the unfortunate distinction of passing away while in office. He passed away at the advanced age of 65, which was common at the time. But a few days before he passed away, he was cheerful at a 4th of July ceremony. Supporters questioned whether he had been poisoned after his sudden passing. Tailor had at the time been adamantly opposed to allowing slavery in the West. His admirers, therefore, questioned whether the milk and cherries he consumed on July 4th were tainted by pro-slavery rebels. But no concrete evidence of poisoning was ever uncovered. Tailor was laid to rest in his native Kentucky. He peacefully dozed off for a while. However, there was more discussion about the possibility of poisoning over the following century. The former president was exhumed for an autopsy in 1991. The procedure was carried out by the chief medical examiner of Kentucky. He definitively established that Tailor had not been poisoned. Tailor died of a myriad of natural diseases which could have produced the symptoms of gastroenteritis, according to the dead doctor's report. At the conclusion, lawmakers ordered Tailor to be reburied 140 years later. He is currently interred in Louisville's National Cemetery bearing his name. 7. John Taylor. Prior to Polk, John Taylor was the 10th President of the United States. The Civil War was in its middle years when the Southerners passed away in 1862. In his final days, he had won a seat in the rebel Confederacy's legislature. As a result, rebels kept the body of the Virginian on their side of the horrifyingly bloody conflict. This infuriated the men on both sides of the conflict and changed the location of Taylor's final resting place. The New York Times published a vicious obituary for Taylor, claiming that he died amid the ruins of his native state. Taylor himself was one of its architects, and beneath that melancholy wreck, his name will be buried. Instead of being inscribed on the monumental marble of the Capitol, monumental marble, as he had so desperately wanted a year prior, it would turn out that the obituary writer was accurate. Taylor had asked for a straightforward burial at Richmond, Virginia's Hollywood Cemetery. That didn't take place. Confederate President Jefferson Davis threw Taylor a grand event in an effort to bolster rebel pride. Even Taylor's coffin was covered in a Confederate flag by Davis. Union lawmakers responded by refusing to recognize the former president's final resting place. Taylor is still buried in Richmond as of right now. The previous animosity has persisted as well. He is still the only former president whose final resting place is not acknowledged in Washington, according to cemetery officials. 6. Abraham Lincoln. Following his assassination in 1865, Abraham Lincoln's body was transported by train across the nation. Numerous Americans mourned the death of their president. For the journey, the body was embalmed, a relatively new practice at the time. But it wasn't quite perfected yet. Morticians had to accompany Lincoln's body on the 19-day train trip and re-embalm it at each stop. The experts tried to stop the corpse's eventual decay, but they were unsuccessful. It will not be possible, despite the affection of the embalming, to continue much longer the exhibition, a reporter wrote after the train stopped in New York. The constant shaking of the body, assisted by the exposure to the air and the increasing of dust, has already undone much of the workmanship. Thankfully, Lincoln was finally buried in an Illinois tomb after 3 weeks. A gang of criminals came up with a scheme to steal Lincoln's remains and hold them for ransom 10 years later, in 1876. The deceased president's tomb was unguarded, and the marble sarcophagus that served as his final resting place had only been loosely sealed. The group was unaware that they had told a man who was a government informant about their plan. Officers were waiting the day the crew visited the tomb after he informed the Secret Service. After that almost steal, Lincoln's remains were covertly interred in the vault's cellar. He was once more disinterred and reburied beneath 10 feet of concrete in a steel cage in 1901. 5. Warren G. Harding. In 1923, Warren G. Harding passed away unexpectedly in a hotel in San Francisco. He was in the middle of a national speaking tour at the time. He had recently experienced food poisoning as well. However, nobody anticipated his sudden departure. His wife Florence insisted on immediate embalming and no autopsy for the aftereffects. Doctors for Harding were enraged. They were curious as to what had suddenly taken the president's life. We shall never know exactly the immediate cause of President Harding's death, since every effort that was made to secure an autopsy met with complete and final refusal, one angry medical professional even wrote. However, the bereaved widow remained unmoved and her late husband was buried. The public initially held Harding's doctors accountable for his demise, but the truth began to surface a few years later. A woman by the name of Nan Britton published a tell-all book about an alleged liaison with Harding in 1928. Additionally, a former employee of the administration claimed in a book published in 1930 that Florence poisoned her husband after discovering the affair. The descendants of Britton then asked questions about their ancestry almost a century later. Due to ancestry evidence, they were connected to Harding, and they sued the late president's children as a result. But Harding's descendants gave in before his body could be exhumed for DNA verification. They acknowledged that Harding and Britain had an affair that resulted in a child. 4. Franklin D. Roosevelt. One of the best presidents of the United States was Franklin D. Roosevelt. He presided over the nation for slightly more than 3 terms, which included most of the Great Depression and World War II. He had been seriously ill for a very long time before he passed away in 1945. Still, nobody anticipated his passing. When he passed away, Roosevelt was with a purported mistress at one of his vacation homes. He claimed to have experienced a terrific pain in the back of my head before falling asleep. He died 3 hours later. Officials knew how crucial it was to embalm a body as soon as possible after death, but they took their time. After the president passed away, it took 4 hours before an undertaker was contacted. Aides were patiently awaiting the arrival of Eleanor Roosevelt as the next of kin. The embalming process finally started 9 hours later. F. Hayden Snodderly, the undertaker, wrote a detailed 15-page memo outlining the major problems he was currently dealing with. He stated that by the time embalming began, rigor mortis had set in, and Roosevelt's abdomen had become noticeably distended. Even worse, Snodderly found it nearly impossible to inject embalming fluid into the great man's veins because FDR's arteries were sclerotic. Because the procedure was so challenging, claims that Roosevelt had been poisoned and that his body had turned black after his death later surfaced in books. Although those allegations were untrue, rumors persisted. The president preferred to keep things simple when it came to FDR's afterlife. He left very specific instructions, requesting a simple casket, a low-key funeral, and no lying in state. 3. John F. Kennedy. The body of John F. Kennedy is interred at Arlington National Cemetery. But he's missing his brain. In 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. His brain was kept during the autopsy in a stainless steel container with a screw-top lid. Agents of the Secret Service kept it safe and sound in a locked file cabinet. It was later transported from there to a secure room inside the National Archives. Then, however, something terrible occurred. Officials learned that Kennedy's brain had disappeared 3 years after his passing. However, no one was aware of when or how the National Archives had lost it. In his book End of Days, author James Swanson described the grisly heist, stating that the brain, the tissue slides, and other autopsy materials were missing, and they have never been seen since. There are many theories surrounding Kennedy's death, but the legend has only grown as a result of his missing brain. Swanson embraced it with his own theory as well. According to the author, JFK's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, stole the organ. Swanson stated, "My conclusion is that Robert Kennedy did take his brother's brain, not to hide evidence of a conspiracy, but perhaps to hide evidence of the true extent of President Kennedy's illnesses, or perhaps to hide evidence of the number of medications that President Kennedy was taking." 2. Tassos Papadopoulos. The former president of Cyprus, Tassos Papadopoulos, passed away from lung cancer in 2008. In the island nation, Papadopoulos was a political hero. His remains were buried in a cemetery in Nicosia after he passed away. The remains were taken, however, on the day before his passing the previous year. A candle of remembrance was lit at Papadopoulos' grave on December 11, 2009, by one of his former bodyguards. The previous evening, it had been very rainy. When the man in mourning got there, the spot where the grave had been was empty and covered with dirt. The shocked man dialed the police right away. The heist baffled the authorities. They were unable to identify any suspects for several weeks. An anonymous tip led police to a different cemetery in Nicosia 3 months later. They discovered Papadopoulos' body in another grave. The tip also provided investigators with a lead. The late president's body was discovered by a man looking for leverage to request his brother's release from prison. The plan fell apart when another accomplice called Papadopoulos' family and demanded money instead. The grave robbers were apprehended and promptly punished. Thankfully, Papadopoulos was laid to rest peacefully. 1. José Eduardo dos Santos. When José Eduardo dos Santos died in early July 2022, it set off a chain of events. After taking power in 1979, dos Santos ruled Angola for decades. During that time, his regime presided over a bloody civil war. He died in Spain, thousands of miles from his political adversaries. But the geography and timing were both difficult. Dos Santos died in Barcelona on the eve of an already tense election campaign in Angola. His daughter openly claimed that the 79-year-old man was murdered. In Spain, she demanded an autopsy to determine his cause of death. The autopsy was performed, but there was no evidence of wrongdoing. A Spanish judge ruled weeks later, certain of unnatural death, that dos Santos was not the victim of foul play. The judge also ordered that dos Santos' body be given to his widow, Ana Paula, rather than his children. The bereaved wife flew it back to his home country just days before the August elections. The current Angolan government objected to the option but eventually agreed to it. Longtime supporters greeted the late president's casket at Luanda's airport and wept as it passed through the city. Finally, after a long waiting period, dos Santos was laid to rest in the capital in August.